Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words. Hi, I'm Oscar Trimboli, and this is the Deep Listening podcast series designed to move you from an unconscious listener to a deep and productive listener. Did you know you spend 55% of your day listening, yet only 2% of us have had any listening training whatsoever? Frustration, misunderstanding, wasted time and opportunity, along with creating poor relationships, are just some of the costs of not listening. Each episode of the series is designed to provide you with practical, actionable, and impactful tips to move you through the 5 levels of listening. So I invite you to visit oscartrimboli.com/Facebook to learn about the 5 levels of listening and how others are making an impact beyond words.
Newsrooms that deploy, this listening first model, the people who are interacting with it are 2 to 5 times more likely to become paying members. When you're in person, I think it makes such a huge difference to see how people are holding themselves when they're pausing, when they're looking uncomfortable or sounding uncomfortable. So the more information you get, I think the more you can listen to their full body and not just the content of what they're saying. I think oftentimes the real story lies in things that they're not saying.
If you're used to the transactional mode of listening and someone tells you or talks to you about this more, building connections versus gathering stories, it's going to seem on the face of it like a lot of work. But longer term, it's a lot more rewarding. It's better for the community. You're actually, adding to their world instead of taking from it. And I think it actually gets you better stories. It gets you much better, much richer stories anyways.
And then for the people that I was interviewing, I really felt like I was violating them in some way, in that I wasn't there to listen to what they had to say. I was there to listen for things that I thought I already knew and confirm them.
In this episode of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, we turn the tables on some experienced journalists. Today, we listen to Andrew and Jennifer, who discuss what listening means when it comes to journalism. Jennifer and Andrew explain the cost of not listening. Listen out for the story where Jennifer almost feels ashamed that she was told by one of her editors to write a story and then go and find the quotes to match the story. Learn about the cost of not listening for the community, for the reputation of the journalist, and for the actual story. Listen out for Andrew talking about the impact of transactional listening as he talks about the cost of that for both the journalist and the community. He explains how a great enterprise in Durham, North Carolina, used the power of listening not only to connect the journalist with the people in the community, but to connect the community with each other. The underlying theme in this episode is about the power of the unsaid and how the unsaid can be discovered faster by meeting people face to face. Both Andrew and Jennifer talk about the importance of getting out and seeing people in their own environments, and then you're able to listen for the real story.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
In speaking to others, I've been told the difference between a good journalist and a great journalist is really all about listening.
I would agree with that. I do think that listening is key to uncovering not just the story that you think you're reporting, but learning about all the stories you didn't even know you needed to report and the depth of information that you needed to report them as richly and honestly as you can. I know I was kind of scandalized early on in my life when I was first becoming a reporter and learning how to do it. I had a mentor who was really wonderful, but she told me to essentially write the story before I went out in the world based on what I could figure out by, searching online, and then go out and find people to give me the quotes that I needed to really fill in the blanks and get the story done as soon as possible. And so that was not preferencing listening. That was preferencing efficiency and distribution and kind of feeding a machine versus actually doing the job of journalism And ever since then, I've been thinking, how do I promote the opposite in the world, which is, not thinking about interactions with people as for what I need to extract and create and pump out into the world, but what are the relationship fundamentals that actually leave us both better off than when we started.
Jen, what do you think the cost of that pre-assembled approach was, both for yourself and for the people you're writing stories about?
Oh, that's a great question. I know for myself, it just felt deeply wrong. It felt like it was counter to the point of trying to put out good information into the world. And then for the people that I was interviewing, I really felt like I was violating them in some way, in that I wasn't there to listen to what they had to say. I was there to listen for things that I thought I already knew and confirm them. And so it really meant that I had less of an ability to be surprised and for my mind to be changed and for the story to go in different directions. And that means I can't tell their story accurately, which means one more false narrative goes out into the world, which compounds and creates distorted reality. So I would say it's pretty serious on the level of just one interview. And then when you think about it as being, the backbone of the entire industry is really a lot of it is so built on production and distribution and efficiency that it's really no wonder why we're in the spot we are right now in journalism and just overall communication with communities. So I would say that pretty soon when I learned that when I was just learning to become a journalist and this was what I was taught, I really thought to myself, this doesn't feel right. And I wonder if there's a way I can do it differently. And so I was a freelancer at that time. And I thought to myself, what does my hourly rate come out to? And if I did it the efficient way, my hourly rate actually was okay. It wasn't great. Definitely not something you can save on, but I could make it work. But if I really wanted to listen to people and have those better interactions, my hourly rate would plummet to the point where I couldn't make a living. So I ended up taking on a couple other additional jobs and just taking longer to do stories so that I could do the kind of listening I felt was required to report honestly and to report, authentically in the way that I felt it should be done. So I don't know stories from the outcome of the community's point of view, other than, you do stories and people tell you that you got it wrong. And that's one way of showing that you weren't totally listening as well as you could have. But that was, I guess, the part I could control was at least how much time I was putting into it.
Who are the journalists you admire as great role models of listening?
Andrew Haeg is definitely one, and his work in GroundSource, which I know we'll get to in a second. But I think he really does incredible work, and has built a foundation of different models and ways of thinking, really built on listening. Jesse Hardman is an incredible listener as well. He's collaborated with Andrew a number of times on doing listening posts. So working with communities to truly listen to them and to start reporting from a place of listening rather than a place of an assignment. And then there are a number of kind of unsung heroes out there who are doing incredible listening. The folks at City Bureau in Chicago are doing great work. Madeline Baer at El Timpano in Oakland. Yeah, there's a lot of people working at the intersection of engagement and journalism that I think are fabulous listeners.
Thinking about Madeline and Jess and Andrew, what are the characteristics they bring as listeners that we could all learn from?
I think they bring a level of holistic understanding about the way that not only people work as individuals, but ecosystems and community information systems work. And they know that the point of what they're doing is not to create stories, it's to create connections. And that requires different approaches and mentalities and outputs and just mental models as well. And so I think they're there to look at journalism as a vehicle for change rather than an end in and of itself.
And for you, Andrew, who are the journalists you admired?
Growing up, there was an American broadcaster. He's since passed. His name is Charles Osgood. He used to go to communities around the country as part of CBS This Morning. The level of empathy he had, the level of openness to other people's experiences, and the patience he had. Also, listening is about let's be honest, finding great stories too. It's not just about letting people express themselves, but oftentimes the great stories emerge when you are quiet enough to listen for them. But I think to your question about stories versus connections or creating connections, I think so much of in building on what Jen said, I think so much of what we do in journalism is we parachute into communities in order to extract stories. Like they're the prize we pluck out of the community. Like I go to this neighborhood and I want to go find a great quote or a great story. And the attitude you bring to that community, if all you're doing is kind of trying to extract the great story, is one of greed and one of transactional listening, where, you talk to the shop owner like, hey, who do I talk to get, to who has this experience or that experience, and all of that. And, the kind of transactional listening I was describing, means that you're approaching people to take something from them and to create value around it that they won't experience any benefit from. Whereas building connections is all about understanding where you can help a community tell its own story and therefore help it build capacity to understand itself. And so when you go into a community and you're thinking in terms of connections or helping, build capacity, you're often making sure that you're talking to enough people and reaching out to people who maybe aren't as eager to tell their story or able to tell their story, because your goal is one of getting coverage or in a sense, buy-in from the community. So, and that's much harder work. It's not necessarily the work we've traditionally done as journalists. And, if you're used to the transactional mode of listening and someone tells you or talks to you about this more, building connections versus gathering stories, it's going to seem on the face of it like a lot of work. But longer term, it's a lot more rewarding. It's better for the community. You're actually, adding to their world instead of taking from it. And I think it actually gets you better stories. It gets you much better, much richer stories anyways.
Andrew, Jen, have you got any stories that really bring the distinction between transactional listening and connection listening to life?
So in Chicago, there's a newsroom called WBEZ or WBEZ for international folks who don't use the Z. And they're a public radio station. So they do national public radio broadcasting and local coverage. I started a series in 2012 called Curious City. And what it was about listening to the public's questions about Chicago and the region so that reporters could be in service to the community. So rather than the reporter saying, we know what you need to know, they started with a more humble posture of saying, you know what you don't know. Tell us what you want to have, what information you want to have created, and we'll make it for you because that's our job. And so there's been really incredible stories that have resulted from this listening first approach. Recently, a woman in Chicago wanted to know if Chicago's Arab and African American Muslim communities shared mosques with each other. And so she asked the newsroom, and they decided this was an interesting story through listening to the community, because the community voted on this versus a couple other stories. And they ended up doing it. And how they did it was they brought together 4 different imams from different mosques around Chicago to have that conversation with each other. And so the reporter really acted as a facilitator to let them speak and get to know each other and listen to each other. And at the end of that conversation that they recorded, and made into, produced a segment to air on the radio and to put on their website, the imam said, I feel like this is a great start to a conversation that we should be continuing with our communities. So not just us, the leaders, but bringing it out to the world as well. And so a few weeks later, they reached out, these imams who had never really been in touch before, to WBEZ to say, could you facilitate a community conversation with the people who come to our mosques to really take what we've started and keep that conversation going. And so I feel like by journalists being able to model what good and supportive listening can look like, and listening can look like making space to listen to others talk to each other versus you talking to them. That was to me a really wonderful example of listening not just to sources, but letting sources talk to and listen to each other and come to their own, understanding and for them to be able to communicate new needs back to the newsroom that the newsroom then decided to fulfill.
in Durham, North Carolina, with one of our clients, partners, a group called Education North Carolina. We conducted a pilot called The Pulse, which was designed using text messaging to kind of take the pulse of a representative sample of people in Durham, North Carolina, to understand their information needs on a daily basis. And then at the end of that, we convened a dinner inviting Pulse participants to join us at a restaurant, and we had a conversation. And what struck me there, and this is an experience I've had many times, is how hungry people are for that kind of connection and how few opportunities they get to have a conversation outside of the boundaries of their, relatively narrow social networks, depending on, what kind of, networks they run in. And they, to a person said, can we do this again? We want to stay in touch. How do we stay in touch with the group? And these are people who had met, not 90 minutes prior to that. And I think it's those kinds of experiences and that one in particular have helped me evolve my thinking of what a journalist is and what a journalist does from, someone who gets quotes, tells stories, holds truth, tells truth to power, speaks truth to power, and makes, elected officials uncomfortable, to more of a facilitator, a convener, a connector, even a catalyst for a community to connect to itself in ways that it may not be able to. Less a storyteller, although that is an important function of journalism still in my mind, is creating a space where a community can have can connect to itself in a civil and empathetic way, in a way that social media really doesn't afford, nor do comments at the end of news stories. What came up time and time again was the interest and the willingness of people in Durham to help people who were being dislocated or otherwise affected by the rapid growth and change. And that's something that wasn't necessarily coming out in the news, that there was this that people, even the people who are benefiting from all these changes, restaurant owners or, wealthier, younger professionals, we're sensitive to the fact that there are sometimes winners and losers when the community changes that fast. And it was more a matter of how they framed the discussion around those topics than the choice of any one topic. And I think, if you were to just look at it, like I said, from a journalistic standpoint, you might look at the rise of housing prices and talk about the effects, people who are losing out. You might also do the story on how the government ought to, provide some solution to the problem at some level. But you might not do the story on the kind of underlying desire upon, a lot of people in Durham to help those who are being dislocated and affected. And I think it speaks to something I've been thinking a lot about lately, is that it's kind of the entrenched institutional bias in a lot of journalism, in that, the logic behind a lot of the journalism we do is that if we just shine a light in enough places, that there's going to be someone in the government or someone there to solve the problem at the end, when that story gets enough attention. And, what if the solutions are inherent, are resident in our community, and not necessarily, we don't necessarily have to look to the government to solve all problems. And that's the kind of nuance and reframing you get if you really sit down and listen to people and talk to people.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Penne ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
Few would argue against the importance of empathy for any person with true leadership aspirations. Empathy requires more than listening. The person must feel genuinely listened to. This is a skill seldom taught and often misunderstood, but no longer. Oscar Trimboli's beautifully crafted book changes everything. It gets better with each reading, yet the impact is as immediate as your next conversation. The result? Leaders can now truly lead. Better leaders will create more better leaders, who, when they take up their leadership role, should have a copy of Oscar's book waiting for them. It will be the gift that keeps on giving.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
Oftentimes, if you're not listening very closely, if you're just doing the annual or biannual kind of dipstick survey with 30 questions and SurveyMonkey, and or you've just flown on say Delta Airlines in the States, and you get the email with the follow-up saying, hey, how was our service? And then, there's the 10-point Net Promoter Score survey, and then, there's the whole methodology for how you process all that feedback. You're going to get a certain kind of feedback, and it may help you improve your service marginally, but you're not going to understand the context behind that feedback in a lot of cases, and you're only going to hear from people who are either very upset or very happy for some reason. And you're missing out on that the silent majority of people who are experiencing your product, your service, whatever, who are having an experience and may not be agitated or happy enough to go and fill out the survey form or incentivized enough. And therefore, you're not doing the job of listening to the majority of the people who are using your product or service, and you don't understand how it fits into their life necessarily. So I think there's a very strong case to be made that the organizations, companies that are the best at inviting continual feedback and continually listening are going to be the most adaptable and the most responsive to the needs of their customers or their community.
You talked about listening for both context and unsaid. As a journalist, how do you listen for what's not being said?
Any form of communication that you are using with people is going to have some degree of limitation, except if you're in person with someone. And even that has its own dynamics. So I think when you are emailing with people, you are most likely to get, miss other information because you only have words. You don't have tone of voice. You don't have, context. People tend to be shorter on email than they would in a conversation. And then when you're on the phone with someone, you don't have facial expressions to see. You don't have posture to observe and understand. And so when you're in person, I think it makes such a huge difference to see how people are holding themselves when they're pausing, when they're looking uncomfortable or sounding uncomfortable. So the more information you get, I think the more you can listen to their full body and not just the content of what they're saying. I think oftentimes the real story lies in things that they're not saying, things that they're expressing in other ways. And so to me, being a journalist, the best part is when you can be out there in real life with people, which isn't the way that you can always do it if you're producing topic-based coverage where it's not geographically based and you can't be where other people are. But even doing video calls is so much more telling than just, phone or email interviews. So I think, taking in the full person as much as you can and listening to the full person is so helpful. I guess I would ask them so how is what you're doing now working out for you? I think we've actually reached this moment, which is incredible and terrible in its own way, that everything people have been trying has not worked for some reason or another, whether it was because of, the changes in technology and the business model and the climate of politics in various countries, nothing else has been working. So why don't we go back to basics, which is, to me, you can, really define journalism in a lot of different ways. But to me, in a democracy, citizens are the most important actors. And what journalists and news organizations should be dead focused on is giving them the information they need to make decisions about their families, their lives, their communities, their government. And you can't do that if you don't know what information they need and if you're assuming that you know what information they need. And increasingly, as newsrooms shrink and they have fewer people out there, in their organization to make those calls, the worse their inputs are getting in terms of what to cover because they have fewer perspectives around the table. So I think listening is actually a business imperative because in some way it helps you make sure the content you are putting out there is as relevant as it possibly can be versus thinking of it as yet an additional thing to do. I think of listening as a way to do what you're doing way better than, an add-on, I guess, is what I'd say. We're starting to get the data back that shows it because who doesn't want data in a data-driven world? But we are seeing that when you listen to people, they are more likely to become closer to you, which sounds so dumb because it's so logical, but we have to prove it with data. So the more you listen to people, the more relevant content you make, with the technology that my company helps newsrooms deploy, you also collect their email address, which means you can subscribe them if they opt in to a newsletter. You can put them on the path to becoming a member or a subscriber, paying to your organization if that's the model that you use. So we're finding that newsrooms that deploy, this listening first model, the people who are interacting with it are 2 to 5 times more likely to become paying members. And then we're also finding that the content that's produced through this approach ends up performing a lot better on all the different platforms that it is put out on. So that's also a good economic imperative for advertisers in terms of, you can ask them for higher rates if your content is being viewed by more people that their ads are on. So there are economic imperatives there as well.
The value of a very large, thinly engaged audience is rapidly declining, and the ability to advertise that audience is and make enough money to run your publication or your podcast or whatever is quickly dissolving. So I think one of the main features of it is smaller, more deeply engaged audiences, and you could argue kind of that this is a net benefit or a net good or a net bad for society, because sometimes those smaller, more engaged audiences are going to be wealthier and more attractive to advertisers. And what we're doing is trying to listen to them or trying to connect with them. But if you can connect with communities and create a sense of rapport and loyalty and trust, such that when you put something out into the world, they're going to pay attention to it. And when you hold an event, they're going to attend it. And when you seek for membership support, they're going to respond to it. The chances are that you can build a sustainable media organization by deeply connecting with far fewer people than you would need with an ad-based scale model to reach in order to make a content company of some sort, make the economics of that work. So I think that smaller, more deeply engaged communities built around a sense of loyalty, a sense of two-way conversation, a sense of deeper connection, that model is emerging as more and more news organizations move to membership and subscription models. That's the imperative there, is to deeply engage smaller audiences.
Jen, we've spent a lot of time talking about the impact of listening for individual journalists. You and Andrew and the industry have looked at it in a much more broader and systematic context, where you've put together some work with a foundation, a funding model, software, training, to scale listening beyond the individual journalist.
We were looking to try and figure out what's a way where we can help inspire newsrooms to do this work more quickly and with more focus. And so as much as Andrew and I were having success on, doing this one by one, just trying to find the types of journalists in the newsrooms who were interested in this work, we knew that there would be more of an impetus to get started in this work if the leading funders of journalism got involved. And so we invited and worked with a great contingent of people who had been interested in the work that we were doing and wanted to help, catalyze its hold on the industry. And so we worked with the News Integrity Initiative at the City University of New York, the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, the Democracy Fund, and the Knight Foundation to put together a fund to help really inspire newsrooms to make this a priority. So, as a software and services company that, Andrew and I each run, we are beholden to trying to get organizations to listen to us. And that's not easy when, they are the ones in the power position. They're the ones dictating their budgets and their schedules and their time. And when a foundation is involved, the power dynamics totally change. So instead of us saying, hey, newsroom, please, do the stories you said you were going to, the foundation can put a grant together that says, you need to do these stories and we are going to give you money to do them. And we are going to expect that you, follow the rules and report here. So I feel like it's really, changing the dynamics between all of us in a really positive way, so that news organizations don't want to disappoint the funders because they would like to get funding from them for other things. And money is a huge concern for pretty much every news outlet I know. So the fact that they can get paid to start experimenting with this work is a really good dynamic. And it means that hopefully they will be able to listen to us a little more quickly than they would have if it was just on their own.
And I think that's really where the foundation, came together. And this was a very unique, and I would hesitate to say, but I think it is an unprecedented collaboration, certainly amongst these four funders. And I think they see this as a moment where big strokes are needed, and they're looking to do things that are catalytic. And by bringing us together, not only us, our two platforms and services, but also these four foundations, they are kind of planting their flag, saying that listening is the value in newsrooms that they will be supporting. And if you're, if you're a newsroom, a nonprofit newsroom, or another newsroom that is out there looking for foundation funding, you're going to pay attention to those signals. So I think there's a lot of layers to it that could end up having impact. Not the least of which is just being trained in on the tools, but also the signal that this sends the broader industry, and the specific actual use cases that grow out of actually using the services in their communities.
In creating an initiative across the Community Listening and Engagement Fund, the foundations, the News Integrity Initiative, the Democracy Fund, the Lenfest Institute, the Knight Foundation, for each of you, what have you had to change or learn about how you listen in coalitions rather than just in one-on-one dialogues?
How this whole thing has come together, it has been highly collaborative, where there hasn't really necessarily been a lead anything. We've all kind of figured out what is needed in the fund, who can provide things. We ask a lot of questions.
I feel like, whether it's because of the elections or because of the broader disruption in the news industry, suddenly there's a critical mass of people who are willing to really listen to one another and collaborate at a very fundamental level.
Racing through my head is the question I should have asked either of you that I haven't, that you think would benefit the audience in terms of understanding how to move from unconscious shallow listeners to deep and powerful listeners.
So this might be a little bit far afield, but I'll go there, is that there's this incredible book I'm reading by this woman, Adrienne Marie Brown, and it's called Emergent Strategy. And I find myself underlining and highlighting and writing in the margins on basically every page. So it's one of those books. And she has this sentence that I'll read to you now, which is that healing happens when a place of trauma or pain is given full attention, really listened to. I think about that in terms of, what if you could be a version of a doctor, without going to school and studying and doing all that work? What if you could be as powerful in listening to others and being fully present for them, that they are able to heal some part of themselves or be seen or feel validated? What if all of us could become healers just by the fact of the way that we listen to one another? And when I think about that in terms of newsrooms and journalism, every day people are out there listening for a living. If they could do it a little bit differently, a little bit more intentionally or consciously, and thought of it as a possibility of not just they were getting information, but they were actually providing a healing activity for a community or for a person they were listening to.
And I don't think there's a day that goes by where I don't experience this at some level, that there's an inherent tension in doing the work of listening and even, building a company around it. Is that in order to listen, in at least in a lot of contexts, you need to have a question formulated, and there are many contexts and places and times in which you don't even know what the right question is. So the very process of coming up with a question that's going to evoke the response you're looking for, or evoke a response, or get people to start talking about something, in and of itself is sometimes the biggest challenge. And the projects that I've seen that have been most successful are the ones that have that come in with that sense of humility. And I think that's the journalists I'm and professionals I'm drawn to are the ones who, even though they've been at it, whatever, they could be veterans, they could have been at their particular profession 15, 20, 30 years, but they still bring to every, interaction the mind of a beginner or one where they know that there's a nugget of truth or a deeper sense of wisdom that can only be drawn out with the right mix of questions and listening. I think it was during the 2012 or 2008, actually maybe as far back as 2008, they did something called Off the Bus, which is during the presidential campaign, as the name would suggest, they didn't follow the candidates around on their buses. They got off the bus and got into communities and talking to people about kind of the issues that matter to them. And I think that planted some of the seeds for the Listen America stuff. And I know Lydia Polgreen, I don't know her personally, but I know that she's been very, and since she was made editor of HuffPo, she's been very interested in developing more grassroots kind of listening initiatives, not only to make the kind of national HuffPo products better, but also to kind of link up with local news and local journalism.
In speaking to organisations like HuffPost, BBC and ABC journalists, one of the messages I hear regularly is that good journalists listen for facts and great journalists explore what's unsaid and try and understand the meaning.
A lot of my work with GroundSource and the work I've been doing for the past 15 years is building tools and approaches and frameworks to help journalists listen more effectively to communities. And a lot, when I go to newsrooms or I talk to journalists about doing this work, I often talk about the merits of not just listening for quotes, of trying to understand what people are attempting to express, but maybe don't have the words to express it. Especially when it comes to, it's not just the individual journalist, individual source relationship. I mean, I think there's when you're in that environment, you're in a face-to-face conversation, you can observe posture, you can observe nonverbals, to sense whether or not what they're saying is something they actually think or believe, or if it's a talking point that's been handed to them by someone else. And then you can use, active listening and questions to kind of steer them out of their comfort zone and into places where they're responding genuinely. But a lot of the work I do is trying to do that kind of work, but at scale. So, you're kind of building engagement with a community around a topic or a subject or a show or something, and you're getting them to reflect back to you stories or perspectives. And I think oftentimes when we look at how audiences engage with journalism online, on social media or on comments at the end of stories, oftentimes we take what they're saying literally. Sadness expresses as anger. So people are sad about something that's changing in the world, sad about how rapidly, their communities, the complexion of their community is changing, sadness that their job or their profession is being kind of outmoded by automation, sadness about, this, that, or the other thing. When they go into an environment like a comment section on social media, oftentimes that sadness kind of converts into anger. And if you're just listening to the anger, you're going to think everyone's walking around, full of hate. And really what a lot of people are trying to do is make their voice heard. And they feel like the only way to do that is to be extreme in some way. And then I found as a journalist and someone who works kind of engaging audiences, that the moment you reach out to that person and ask them some just questions saying, appreciated your comments on that story, just wanted to hear more about why you feel that way, they immediately soften their stance and they say, oh, I didn't realize anyone was actually going to read that thing. And wow, so cool that you reached out to me. And here's what I actually feel. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations like that with people who would otherwise discount as being hacks or trolls or, super angry about something. What is our community trying to tell us that they're not able to say? They don't have the words to say. They don't have the concepts to say. And, our job as journalists is to listen beyond that and to listen into the spaces where, they're like sentiment or attitude for something.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening.
I wonder what you took away from the interview with Jennifer and Andrew today. I wonder what you'll do differently as a result. What I'll be doing differently is thinking about listening not only to individuals, to teams and organisations, but with their listening initiative across industries and ecosystems, connecting large philanthropic organisations, universities, and journalistic initiatives to ensure that listening is embedded into what they do is something that I can take into my work in consulting with my clients across all sorts of industries. I also took away how important it is to listen to what's unsaid. While Andrew was talking about listening to what's unsaid, he talked about the Listen to America tour, which in episode 29 with Hilary Fry, we spent a lot of time understanding how the Huffington Post spent time across nearly 30 cities across the United States and over 1,000 interviews to listen face-to-face to people about what wasn't being heard and what was unsaid. How to help people find their own words rather than trying filling in the gaps for them, finishing off their sentences, or offering them your words rather than their words. As Andrew said, that people feel so much better heard when they express their own words, even if it takes a bit of awkward silence to get there. How comfortable are you with silence? How comfortable are you to have a nice long pause during the dialogue to help people fully explore what they're thinking? As I listened to Andrew and Jennifer, I couldn't help but think about the 125-400 rule, the fact that you can speak at 125 words a minute, but you can listen at up to 400 words a minute, and exploring the unsaid and asking simple questions that aren't about content will help you discover more about what's unsaid, and more importantly, help the person who's speaking fully explore their thinking so that they can get to their deeper truth. A big thank you to the people who listened to me, to Johnny, to Nell, and to June, the team behind the Deep Listening podcast. Thanks for listening to me. Finally, the words that struck me the most during the interview was when Andrew mentioned the term transactional listening. And what he meant by that is the cost of just listening to get a result rather than listening deeply to what the other person's offering you, not just in what they're saying, but what they're not saying. I'd love to hear from you, so we're listening. Go and visit oscartrimboli.com/Facebook, where you'll have the opportunity not only to hear from me, but to hear from others who are trying to make progress on their journey to become deep listeners. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lourdes Lascelles.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo pohonu.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.